The Viking Age was a period of radical transformation. We're not talking about simple plunderers. This epic saga combines brutal raids, daring maritime explorations, global trade, and a deep Norse mythology that redefined Europe. To understand how these peoples shaped the world, we must explore their roots, battles, journeys, and gods. Like, subscribe, and share. Let's begin. The emergence of the Viking Age cannot be attributed to a single event, but to a confluence of socio-economic, demographic, and technological factors. Before the famous assault on Lindisfarne in 793 after Christ, the Scandinavian peoples, the Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes lived in tribal societies and nascent kingdoms, often embroiled in internal conflicts. They were farmers, fishermen, artisans, and experienced sailors. The initial driving force behind Viking expansion was, to a large extent, the relative overpopulation of Scandinavian farmland and the pursuit of wealth and prestige, especially for young nobles who wished to make a name for themselves outside the strict hierarchy of their household. Naval technology was the crucial enabling factor. The Viking ship, or Drakkar, and the Nar, merchant ship, are testimonies of a mastery of shipbuilding unparalleled in Northern Europe at that time. Viking ships were not only fast and stable on the open sea, but their shallow draft allowed them to sail deep upriver, penetrating into the heart of enemy lands. This combination of speed, surprise attack capability, and river mobility rendered Western Europe's coastal defenses ineffective against the initial assaults. In continental Europe and the British Isles, kingdoms were fragmented or relatively weak, offering rich and poorly defended targets such as monasteries. These centers of worship not only housed treasures of gold, silver, and manuscripts, but were also centers of knowledge, whose destruction or looting represented a symbolic and material blow. The wealth and goods obtained on these early voyages acted as a positive feedback loop. Success funded larger expeditions, attracting more men and raising the status of successful Viking leaders. The most enduring image of the Vikings is that of the axe-wielding warrior, a reputation forged in the fire of their raids. Since the raid on Lindisfarne, attacks have intensified in frequency and scale, evolving from simple acts of piracy to organized military campaigns with political and territorial objectives. The Danes focused predominantly on England and France. In England, the Great Heathen Army, which arrived in 865 after Christ, marked a paradigm shift. It was no longer a matter of mere looting, but of conquest. Under leaders such as Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan, the Vikings dismantled the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, conquering Northumbria, East Anglia, and much of Mercia. Only the Kingdom of Wessex under Alfred the Great successfully resisted. The Treaty of Wedmore in 878 after Christ formalized the division of England, establishing the Danelaw, a vast region under Danish legal and political control. This settlement was not only military, it was the integration of Viking settlers who brought their laws, customs, and language, leaving an indelible mark on English culture. On the continent, Danish and Norwegian Vikings sailed up rivers such as the Seine, the Loire, and the Garonne, besieging major cities including the famous Siege of Paris in 885 to 886 after Christ. The solution to the Viking threat in France came in 911 after Christ, when King Charles the Simple granted the Viking leader Rollo a portion of the territory that would become Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo and his descendants, the Normans, assimilated quickly, adopting Christianity and French but retaining Viking military daring and organizational skills. Ironically, a century and a half later, these descendants of Vikings would conquer England in 1066 after Christ, bringing an end to the Anglo-Saxon era. The Norwegians, for their part, headed west, colonizing the Shetland Islands, the Orkney Islands, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man, establishing bases that served for agriculture, trade, and piracy. They founded maritime kingdoms with settlements like Dublin, which became an important center of Viking power and trade in Ireland. The Swedes, or Varangians, looked east, sailing up the rivers of Eastern Europe, such as the Dnieper and the Volga. They established trade routes that connected the Baltic with the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim caliphates. They founded fortified trading posts that eventually became the first Slavic political entities, such as Kiev and Novgorod. Nestor's chronicle recounts the invitation made to the Varangian leader Rurik to govern the Slavs, laying the foundations of Kievan Rus, the precursor to the Russian state. The Varangians also served as elite mercenaries in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, a formidable force known for its loyalty and ferocity. The Viking warrior, the Vikinger, was not just a predator, he was part of a hierarchical society. There existed the figure of the berserker, warriors who supposedly entered a trance of fury in combat, and the Drengur, the brave and loyal man. Warfare was a seasonal activity, often carried out by bands of free men who banded together under a chief for the summer season, returning to their farms in winter. The discipline and organization of these bands along with their superior weaponry, including wrought iron swords, chainmail and round shields, gave them a significant tactical advantage in initial encounters. Beyond the violence, the Vikings were exceptional explorers and traders. Trade was the lifeblood of his expeditions. The need for luxury goods, Islamic silver, Byzantine silk, spices, and strategic resources, slaves, furs, wood, drove the development of trade routes across the northern hemisphere. Key settlements such as Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, and Kaupang in Norway flourished as nodes in a trade network that stretched from Greenland to Baghdad. The Vikings acted as intermediaries, transporting goods from the far north and east, amber, marten furs, walrus ivory, slaves, in exchange for silver, coins, fine fabrics, and weapons. Islamic silver, obtained through eastern routes, was the main form of wealth and currency during much of the Viking Age. The appearance of hordes of Arab coins in Scandinavia is a silent testimony to the vast extent of their trade contacts. Viking exploration reached its peak in the North Atlantic, driven by overpopulation, internal political struggles, and the search for new grazing lands. The Norwegians ventured further and further west. Iceland was the first great discovery and colonization, from 870 after Christ onwards. Settlers, often fleeing the growing authority of kings like Harald Fairhair, settled in Iceland. There they created the Althing, the oldest parliament in the world, a legislative and judicial assembly that governed the Icelandic Commonwealth with a complex and decentralized legal structure, recorded in the Gragas, Laws of the Grey Goose. The Icelandic saga, transmitted orally and later written down, is the main source of knowledge about Viking life, genealogies, and mentality. From Iceland, the exploration continued. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for murder, discovered and colonized Greenland around 985 after Christ. The eastern and western settlements of Greenland were Viking communities that persisted for almost 500 years, maintaining a precarious balance of farming, herding, and walrus hunting, while trading valuable ivory with Europe. The pinnacle of exploration is undoubtedly the discovery and attempts to colonize North America. According to the sagas of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west and discovered a land he called Vinland, identified by most archaeologists with Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland. Canada, a site containing the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. Although the settlement in Vinland was short-lived, probably due to conflicts with the indigenous peoples, Skraelings, and the distance from the centers of power, this fact cements the Vikings as the first known Europeans to set foot on the American continent, almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus. The Viking Age developed at the crossroads of Norse paganism and Christianity. To understand the Viking psyche, especially their fearlessness in war, it is imperative to understand their mythology and their concept of destiny. Norse paganism was not a dogmatic religion with a unified sacred scripture, but a body of myths, rituals, and beliefs deeply rooted in nature and warfare. The Norse cosmos was divided into 9 worlds united by the cosmic ash tree Yggdrasil. The world of men was Midgard, Asgard was the home of the Aesir gods, and Vanaheim the home of the Vanir gods. The main gods were Odin, the father of all, god of war, wisdom, poetry, and magic. Odin was a complex god, often associated with the ecstasies of battle and hidden knowledge. He ruled from Valhalla, the great hall where the Valkyries collected the fallen warriors. Einherjar. Thor, the god of thunder, protector of Midgard and the most popular among common people. His hammer, Mjolnir, was a symbol of strength and protection against giants. Jotnar. Freya, goddess of love, fertility, war, and magic. Seda. Freya, god of fertility, rain, and sunlight. Central to Viking life was the concept of weird, destination or destination layer, and log, fight. The life of each individual was interwoven by the Norns, who wove the threads of destiny at the foot of Yggdrasil. However, although the ultimate fate of life was predetermined, the way in which one faced it defined the log. Dying bravely in battle not only ensured entry into Valhalla, but also left a legacy of honor that transcended the inevitability of death. This emphasis on courage and eternal fame contributed to the ferocity in combat. Like, subscribe, and share. The end of the world, or Ragnarök, was a crucial concept. It was the final battle in which the gods and men would fight against the forces of chaos led by Loki and the giants. The world would be destroyed and then reborn, a cycle of destruction and renewal that reflected the cyclical view of nature. Funeral rites reflected the belief in an afterlife. Leaders were often buried in boats, filled with goods and sacrifices, sometimes including slaves or animals, to accompany the deceased across Gjallarbrú, the bridge to the afterlife. The discovery of the Oseberg ship and the Gokstad ship offers a rich insight into these rites and the Viking artistic mastery in wood carving. The decline of the Viking Age was a gradual process of assimilation, religious conversion, and consolidation of power. As Viking bands settled down and became ruling elites, as in Normandy the Danelaw or Kievan Rus, their interest shifted from plunder to stability and trade. Conversion to Christianity was the most significant cultural factor at the end of the era. It was not a quick or uniform process. It often began with the elite, who saw Christianity as the religion of the rich and powerful kingdoms of Europe. Dynastic marriages and political alliances played a role. Figures such as the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, whose monument in Jelling boasts of having converted the Danes, and the Norwegian Olaf II, Saint Olaf, were instrumental, sometimes imposing the new faith by force. Christianization led to the integration of Scandinavia into the European cultural and political sphere. Dioceses were established, churches were built, and the social structure moved towards incipient feudal models. Political consolidation in Scandinavia also marked the end of the Viking Age. The formation of unified kingdoms under strong monarchs such as those of Norway, for example, Harald Hardrada, Denmark and Sweden, put an end to the old customs of small-scale raids. These kings directed Nordic military energy towards internal wars or larger, more conventional external campaigns, often in the name of Christendom. The event traditionally cited as the end of the Viking Age is the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 after Christ. There, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking leader, was defeated and killed by the English king Harold Godwinson. 3 weeks later, the Norman conquest of England by William the Conqueror, an assimilated descendant of Rollo, demonstrated that Norse power was no longer manifested through pagan raids, but through an organized and Christianized force. The Viking Age left an undeniable legacy in world history. In genetic terms, studies show a considerable mixing of populations in the British Isles and the North Atlantic. Linguistically, modern English is full of Old Norse loanwords, including everyday words like sky, sky, take, fellow, companion, and law, law. Place names that end in by, town, or thorp, village in the United Kingdom point to ancient Danish settlements. Artistically, the Urnes style and other Viking art styles, woodcarving, metalwork, exhibit a unique dynamism. Its legal system, the Icelandic Commonwealth, was a remarkable political experiment in governance without a centralized executive. Ultimately, the story of the Vikings is that of a group of peoples who, driven by necessity, ambition, and naval superiority, broke down geographical and cultural barriers. They transformed the map of Europe, founded states, established trade routes, and left behind a body of myths and sagas that continue to fascinate and provide a rich source of inspiration to this day, proving that they were much more than mere barbarians. They were warriors, explorers, traders, and the architects of their own formidable era. The study of the Vikings today draws on a combination of sagas, archaeology, and genetic analysis, often challenging the one-sided image of the plunderer to reveal a complex and stratified society that was constantly on the move, seeking new horizons for glory, wealth, and settlement. Viking society, despite its reputation for chaos and war, was highly structured. It was mainly divided into three classes, as described in the Edda poem Rigsdula: the thralls, slaves; the carls, free men or peasants; and the jarls, nobles. The thralls were the basis of the economy, obtained mainly through capture in raids or birth. They had no rights and could be bought, sold, or slaughtered. Viking slavery was not racial but social, and a slave could, in theory, buy his freedom. The carls constituted the vast majority of the population. They were landowners, farmers, artisans, and, crucially, the warriors who formed the bulk of the expeditions. His life revolved around managing the farm, Bor, which was the fundamental economic and social unit, the free woman, husfreyja, in Viking society. The head of the household enjoyed considerable authority, managing finances and the keys to the house. They could inherit property, file for divorce, and were respected in their role. The jarls were the warrior aristocracy, the great landowners and fleet leaders. They were the ones who organized the great raids and maintained military and political power, often fighting for the title of konungur, king, like, subscribe, and share. The law was oral and administered in the Thing, an assembly of free men that served as parliament and court of justice. The Thing was vital for social cohesion, resolving blood disputes, establishing laws, and judging cases. Viking justice was based on monetary compensation, vergeld, to avoid the endless cycles of blood revenge. The Vikings were accomplished craftsmen, especially in woodworking, metalworking, and textiles. His art is characterized by intricate, intertwined designs, often depicting fantastic animals and mythological beings. This animalistic style evolved through several phases: Oseberg, Bora, Jelling, Marman, Ringerike, and Urnes, marking the chronology of the era. Viking art was not only decorative but also narrative and functional. Runestones are perhaps the most accessible artistic testimony. These stones were not gravestones but monuments erected by the living to commemorate relatives who had died, often abroad, as warriors or explorers. Runic inscriptions, often written by court poets called skalds, recount feats of valor and journeys. Goldsmithing and blacksmithing were essential. Viking swords were prestige weapons often imported from the continent, such as the famous Ulfberht swords, but with locally richly decorated hilts and scabbards. Jewelry such as brooches, torques, and bracelets made of silver or gold were not only ornaments, but also forms of wearable wealth and means of payment, often cut into pieces hacked silver during transactions. The silver trade in fact led to a monetary system based on the weight of silver, not just on the minting of coins. Viking supremacy was based on the sea. The design of their ships was, in itself, a technological revolution. The Viking ship was mainly used for warfare and rapid exploration. It was long, narrow, and symmetrical, propelled by sails and oars, capable of reaching high speeds. Its most important feature was the aforementioned shallow draft, which allowed it to slide over sandbanks and dock directly on any beach or travel up rivers without the need for ports or infrastructure. This gave them an insurmountable tactical surprise advantage. The use of oars also meant that they were not dependent on the wind, a crucial advantage in narrow channels or during assault maneuvers. The Nars, the wider and deeper ones, were used for trade and the long-distance transport of settlers and livestock. They relied more on square sails. In naval combat, Vikings often lashed their ships together bow to bow, creating a stable fighting platform, a sort of floating fortress from which they could engage the enemy in close combat. On land, the most common formation was the shield wall, skjaldborg, a formidable defensive and offensive tactic where warriors lined up elbow to elbow with overlapping shields. The speed of their movement and the ferocity of the initial charge, often led by the berserkers, were enough to break the formations of their less disciplined opponents. The impact of the Vikings was paradoxical: destruction and creation. They destroyed the monastic system of early Ireland and decimated Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but simultaneously created a trade network that revived the European economy and founded lasting political entities. The Viking Age, which spanned roughly from the late 8th to the mid-11th century, was not simply a period of raiding and looting, but a complex dynamic of exploration, trade, settlement, and cultural interaction that reshaped the face of Europe. The popular image of the bloodthirsty warrior with an axe has given way, thanks to archaeology and linguistics, to a more nuanced appreciation of the Vikinger, who was as much a shrewd trader and patient settler as he was a formidable warrior. The impact of these Nordic peoples was felt from the steppes of Russia to the shores of North America, leaving an indelible mark on modern politics, law, language, and imagination. The catalyst for the start of the Viking Age remains a subject of scholarly debate. The proposed factors include overpopulation in Scandinavia, the search for new trade routes and wealth, and improvements in naval technology, particularly the construction of the Nar, merchant ship, and the longship, Drakkar, and the attraction of the relatively easy-to-obtain riches from the monastic centers of the British Isles, such as the famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 after Christ. These longships, with their shallow draft and great maneuverability, allowed the Vikings to ascend rivers, penetrating deep into the mainland and outsmarting traditional coastal defenses. The initial incursions quickly gave way to occupation and colonization. In the British Isles, the great heathen army of the 9th century dismantled entire Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Vikings not only stole, but they stayed to cultivate the land. The consolidation of Nordic influence crystallized in the Danelaw, a region in eastern and northern England where Danish laws and customs prevailed. This was not a simple military interregnum, but a profound infusion of Nordic legal culture. The customs of the Danelaw emphasized, for example, the use of local juries, a system that set a fundamental precedent for the later development of English common law. Norse vocabulary also infiltrated Old English, contributing thousands of everyday words such as sky, skill, give, take. This synthesis process culminated in the figure of Canute the Great from 1016 after Christ in Denmark, who managed to unite the thrones of England, Denmark, and Norway in a North Sea empire. Canute, a Christian and astute ruler, not only conquered but ruled with a respect codified by both Anglo-Saxon and Danish laws. The peace and stability that Canute brought to the Danelaw facilitated trade and peaceful assimilation, closing the cycle of war and opening that of structured governance. His reign, and that of his Viking predecessors and successors, ensured that the law and administration of England evolved from an Anglo-Norse synthesis, setting the stage for later Norman reforms. The most successful group in terms of assimilation and projection of Viking power were, paradoxically, those who most quickly abandoned their linguistic roots, the Normans. originally Danish and Norwegian Vikings who settled in northern France under the leadership of Rollo in the 10th century. The Normans adopted the language, religion, and many customs of French culture. However, their vigorous military spirit manifested in the construction of moated and motte and bailey castles, and in their administrative and organizational skills only continued to spread. After the conquest of England in 1066 after Christ by William the Conqueror, the Normans radically transformed the landscape, the aristocracy, and the English language. Beyond England, their influence extended throughout the Mediterranean, establishing kingdoms in Sicily and southern Italy, with the Hautevils, and playing a crucial role in the Crusades in the Middle East. The Normans became the embodiment of Viking tenacity and adaptability, translating their exploratory and warrior spirit into a feudal and Christian context. Simultaneously in the east, the Swedish Vikings, known as Rus, followed the river routes through the vast forests of Eastern Europe. They established trading centers and fortresses that connected the Baltic with Byzantium and the Islamic world. The Kievan Ruses, founded by Varangian leaders such as Rurik, consolidated a vast territory. Although the leadership was originally Nordic, the population and culture became deeply Slavicized, yet retaining the trade and governance structure of its founders. This state would become the seed of the future nations of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, demonstrating the Vikings' ability to be catalysts for state formation in distant territories. The history of the Viking settlement in Greenland offers a melancholic coda to the exploratory impulse of the Viking Age, marking the point where Nordic ambition met the insurmountable limits of the natural world. At the end of the 10th century, the charismatic and cunning Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for murder, led a group of settlers to the icy shores of Greenland. By naming the land Greenland, in a marketing ploy designed to attract more settlers, he laid the foundations of the community. Two main settlements emerged, the eastern settlement, Eystribygd, and the western settlement, Vestribygd. For almost 5 centuries, these settlers clung to these Arctic lands, maintaining a lifestyle that was a precarious mix of traditional Nordic culture and adaptations forced by a climate that, although milder than today's, was relentlessly extreme. Life in Viking Greenland was characterized by a carefully calibrated subsistence economy. Their food and economic base depended on their flocks of sheep and goats, which grazed on the scarce coastal meadows during the short summers. Seal hunting and, to a lesser extent, fishing supplemented their diet. However, their vital connection to the outside world was the export of walrus ivory. Walrus tusks, along with polar bear skins and live falcons, were their main currency of exchange with Europe, allowing them to acquire essential goods such as iron, timber, grain, and luxury items. This dependence on transatlantic trade meant that its prosperity was intrinsically linked to the dynamics of the European market and maritime conditions. However, from the 13th century onwards, a confluence of environmental and economic factors began to erode the fragile foundation of the settlements. The Little Ice Age began its slow but inexorable cooling, significantly impacting the climate of the North Atlantic. The seas became colder and more turbulent, and the ice packs expanded, making shipping routes to Iceland and Norway more dangerous and unpredictable. Pastures for livestock shrank, decreasing agricultural yields, and hunting became less reliable. Simultaneously, European demand for walrus ivory declined drastically. Elephant ivory, more exotic and abundant, began to flow into Europe through alternative trade routes from Africa. Having lost their main export product, the Greenlandic settlers found themselves in an economic trap. Isolated, with aid from the Norwegian crown becoming sporadic and intermittent, the last known ship arrived in 1410 after Christ, and with the ability to farm diminishing, the settlements gradually shrank. Archaeological findings show a decline in health, a reduction in livestock size, and a shift in dietary habits towards the consumption of marine resources, indicating increasing systemic stress. The latest records of eastern settlements date from the beginning of the 15th century. Its eventual disappearance is a mystery shrouded in climate history and sociology. Several theories are being considered: gradual starvation, a final failed voyage in search of help, or even a final confrontation with the Inuit, the Thule, who were expanding southward and were much better suited to survive in the Arctic environment. The inability of the Norse community to fully adapt to an increasingly hostile environment, or to integrate and learn the survival techniques of the Inuit, underscores the turning point of the Viking Age. Unlimited expansion was replaced by the insurmountable limits of geography and climate. Viking ambition had reached its limit. Today, the Viking Age has become a powerful cultural myth. The romantic vision of the 19th century, popularized by opera and literature with its inaccuracies such as the iconic horned helmets, has been replaced by a more nuanced appreciation. Modern research draws on cutting-edge archaeology, linguistics, and meticulous analysis of the Icelandic sagas to paint a more complete picture. In the contemporary imagination, Vikings represent boldness, freedom of movement, resilience, and an indomitable spirit. Their story is not simply a bloody chapter in European history, but the complex interplay between the sword, war, the oar, trade and exploration, and the relentless pursuit of lasting fame and distinction in life and memory. Like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.